Well, hello everyone. We are here today to discuss Nic Stone's new novel, Dear Justice. Before we begin, I'll just have everybody introduce themselves and we'll dive right in. So we'll start with you, Casey.
My name is Casey Maynard. I'm a children's librarian at the Iowa City Public Library, and I select for our youngest readers board books through early readers and DVDs.
All right, and Jen?
I'm Jen, and I work for the Cedar Rapids Public Library, and I'm a programming librarian, which means I do programs from birth to adult for the Cedar Rapids community, but I focus mostly on that older part of the spectrum. So you won't see me in a lot of story times, but you might see me at like school age and above events.
Okay, great. And I'm Victoria. I'm the Teen Services Librarian at Iowa City Public Library. And you will see me mostly working with teens. We haven't had any in yet, but once it gets going. But I have worked with little ones and I've worked with older folks too. But currently, teens is where it's at. So I'm gonna dive right in and share my screen so that Casey and Jen can see, and we will go through. To those of us who are familiar with Read Woke, I'll just give a brief overview for others who may not have heard of it before. So Read Woke is a reading initiative that was started by Cicely Lewis. She's a school librarian, and she wanted to set up this program so that it would challenge a social norm, give a voice to the voiceless, provide information about a group that's been disenfranchised, seek to challenge the status quo, and finally have a protagonist from an underrepresented or oppressed group. So kind of as I was thinking about Dear Justice, I was thinking about some of the other books that came into my mind, and I'll put it to Jen and to Casey too to see if they can either come up with things that maybe it reminded them of, or books that maybe based on Dear Justice, teen or young adults or even adults might like the titles that they suggest. So somebody that I kind of recently stumbled upon was Elizabeth Acevedo, and so I had read her Fire on High and Poet X, and I like these two books, and they reminded me of Dear Justice just in the sense of, you know, as young adults, we're really trying to figure out who we are and what we want out of life, but also we're having to deal with how adults see us and how society sees us. And so I think the way the characters are driven in Elizabeth Acevedo's books here, they're kind of similar to me for Dear Justice, and I think that fans of Dear Justice would more than likely like these stories. The Hate You Gave, Angie Thomas was also somebody that kind of, it was ringing bells in my head, and I thought, you know, this would definitely be an author if you like Nic Stone. I think you'll also like Angie Thomas. And then Sherman Alexie I'd actually read his adult fiction first, but then I went back and read this one. And again, it's about a Native American who grew up on a reservation. He loves cartooning, and he's kind of on this intersectionality between, you know, his Native American roots, but also this white high school that he has to go to, with the only other Native American being the team mascot. And so really, it's a really honest look at, you know, life, and it's pop memoir. And then love, like a love story, is just something that I'm reading right now. And so it's an interesting story. There's I think it's an Iranian young adult who comes over to the States and befriends a girl who has an uncle who is gay, and then ends up meeting a boy at his school who recently just came out, and so he's dealing with, you know, not hurting the girl's feelings, but also, you know, really kind of becoming infatuated with this boy. And so those are kind of interesting plays in this book too. So otherwise, I'll hand it over to Jen and let's go with Jen first and see what you've come up with.
So I know that you mentioned Angie Thomas, and I actually didn't. The book that I think of when I kind of looked over Dear Justice is On the Come Up, and which is her second book. I felt like the two characters were very similar in some ways. She's the main character in On the Come Up is, I felt like, the girl version. She dealt with a lot of the girl stereotypes for being a black young lady, and I also felt like she faces a lot of, I live in a neighborhood that isn't respected, is seen as bad, and I'm rapping, which is a huge part of my culture, but that isn't part of it isn't part of her rap. Her neighborhood is, but not in that kind of elevating drug dealing and carrying guns and things like that, which is often associated with rap. Like, she kept trying to get people to see like that she was using those things as metaphors and not as a way of elevating. So people were really just misunderstanding what she was putting out there in the world. And I feel like that's essentially a lot of what's going on in Dear Justice, is like not understanding. When you get inside that character's head, you're like, oh yeah, this totally their choices make sense. And are authentic, and you're like, well, that's probably what I would choose if I were in their shoes. But from the outside, how that doesn't always look that way. I just started Ghost Boys by Jewel Parker Rhodes, which it kind of reminds me of this. It kind of doesn't remind me of this book, but I definitely recommend it just because it's dealing with a lot of the same kind of ideas that are in Dear Justice as well. And then another book that I love that I feel fits within the Read Woke category is actually a graphic novel by Jen Wang called The Prince and the Dressmaker. And there's some tie-in with Dear Justice in that it kind of it talks about gender fluidity. So just because it's about a boy or a prince that dresses as a princess or likes princess dresses, you don't get the sense that he's necessarily gay and that he likes boys. He just likes dresses, which I like that there's that middle ground that they're exploring in that book, in that graphic novel.
Awesome, thanks. Casey, what about you?
My turn. So I also love Elizabeth Acevedo and Angie Thomas. I recently listened to Elizabeth Acevedo's With the Fire on High, and listening to her poetry from a narration standpoint is just absolutely lovely. It's fully engrossing, and I just devoured that book. It was fantastic. And I would also recommend Jacqueline Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming, in terms of similar voices talking about coming from places of feeling disenfranchised, both in yourself and in your community, and doing your best to rise above and finding that strength within yourself and within your community and your friends and family to bring you out of those places of darkness. And yeah, I love that book. It's, again, fantastic. Yeah. I have started Look Both Ways by Jason Reynolds, and it's a series of short stories. I'm about halfway through, and I really like all of the differing voices in it. I'm still kind of digesting it. I'm not really sure if it's my favorite Jason Reynolds or not, but it is really, really good.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I just read a series of nonfiction essays by really well-known authors called Black Enough. And it's about the intersection of race and identity in America and what it means to be Black and being Black enough for both your community and the outside world.
Yeah, I really like that. I think I'm about halfway through that one too. And there's some really good stories and some really, you know, just the very definition of what does it mean to be Black, and can you be Black and nerdy, or can you be Black in this? It's just, it's really interesting when you're coming of age and you're asking all of these questions, because one group is saying, no, this is what you need to be doing. And another group is saying, well, if you need to fit in, this is, and so you're having this, you know, pull on both sides, or even more than both sides. Yeah, I've enjoyed all the stories that I've read so far in that one. So one of the things that I wanted to ask is if either one of you had read the first book. We'll start with
Dear Martin.
time.
Yeah, I have read Dear Martin. It was a long time ago when it first came out.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, in Bookland, it feels like a long time ago because I've read so many other things since then. But reading Dear Justice was actually a really fun revisit. It's, again, I'm halfway through Dear Justice. I'm kind of digesting this book as well. And it's very good. It's been really fun to see Justice again, but in this different light. And after he's kind of done some of his personal growth from that first book.
Mm-hmm. Did you read the first one, Jen?
I did not read Dear Martin.
Mm-hmm.
And what I did like, so what I like about this book, and I'm really, I like when authors write these books that are connected, but you don't have to read the first one to feel like reading Dear Justice. I don't feel like I missed out on anything or in Dear Martin. You know what I'm saying? Like
right.
This character still feels like a person I know, like it's all fresh and stuff. And I don't need to rely on any information before that. So even if you don't read Dear Martin, I think coming into Dear Justice is still like a perfectly valid way of going at reading it.
Right.
I will say, if you haven't read Dear Martin, I would not be surprised if you don't see as much of Dr. Martin Luther King in it as you anticipate from the title or from the description. That was one thing that I found really surprising about that first book, that, you know, it's called Dear Martin and it's about him writing these letters, but it's also really not. And you don't really see that much of that.
Right. Yeah, I wondered that too. And that's why, you know, if you've read it, Casey, or even, you know, Jen, if you didn't read it, but one of the things that I wondered was why Nic Stone picked Martin Luther King as opposed to, you know, a different person in the movement. You know, I mean, I feel like I've spoke to people and I've read articles where, you know, especially boys could maybe identify more with the work of Malcolm X as opposed to Martin Luther King. And so then in that way, it just kind of made me wonder, do you think that maybe she was, you know, do you think that she did that for a reason?
Part of me wonders if it has to do with Martin Luther King's involvement in peaceful protest and purposely placing her character within the sphere of peaceful protest rather than placing him within the sphere of someone more like Malcolm X, who is at this point in time seen as a little bit more militant, which is not necessarily the case, but is the way that we remember him as a society. And Martin Luther King is definitely, I'd say he's elevated to the status of being someone who's like more akin to a Gandhi for America. And I feel like that was probably important as an authorial choice at the time.
Yeah.
I also think as like, this sounds awful, maybe, but I feel like more people are familiar with the letters of Martin Luther King too, and everything that he said, and people are less familiar with Malcolm X.
And favorability maybe too. in terms of viewpoints and broad appeal, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to Dear Justice then. Do you, even though obviously they've had very differing upbringings, I mean, really, they met in the playground in the beginning of the book, but did you see similarities between Kwan's character and Justice's character?
I see similarities so far in some of the ways that they're choosing to go about handling their viewpoints of the world and placing themselves within the world at large. Of course, I see similarities within the writing style, and so that makes it kind of hard for me to separate the character from the writing at this point, because it's been so long since I've read Martin. And again, I am only halfway through Dear Justice.
Right.
And I really want to see what happens. But that's where I see the most similarities, is in terms of how they internalize what's happening around them and then use that to move through society.
Yeah, one thing that Jen mentioned earlier was, I think you were just talking about, the choices that people make when they have these forced situations or circumstances. And I think, for Justice, he in the book, if you read Dear Martin, his father came back from the war and he was suffering from PTSD and he was abusing his mother. And Justice had entirely different circumstances, where he went to an upscale boarding school, or not a boarding school, but an upscale school. Kwan, on the other hand, grew up looking after his little brother and sister. His mom his dad was somewhere else. He had, a stepfather figure who, would come and go. And I think Kwan was on the right path for a little while, and then, some bad things happened, like, his stepfather figure would take the EBT card and they would have no food. And so then that's how he got into, looking at, he needed to go and take some stuff. And I think also with the math, he got put in like an advanced math class or something. And then he came home and he was so excited to tell his mom and his incarcerated dad. And by the time he got home, he was already been accused of cheating. And so I think, a lot of things, even though some of the things he was doing, the right thing. And I think Justice always struggled with that too, no matter what he was doing, if he's at the wrong place at the wrong time and a police officer sees him, he is still, that target with the target on his back. And I think, for Kwan, there's a little bit of that too. So I think I definitely saw similarities between the two characters in that way. And especially once Kwan was incarcerated and got to talk with Doc, who Justice also talked with, was able to, use literature and use just a level of thinking that he hadn't been exposed to before. And he finally, had somebody that actually was looking out for him. And I think that's something that Justice probably had always had, but for Kwan, it was, his mom was out of the picture because she was dealing with other things. His dad was out of the picture, and he did get the letters much later, and then he knew his dad really did care for him. But before that, it was the only people that he felt had his back were the people in the neighborhood who were part of the gang.
Yeah, it's a question that I feel like that's a common question, is when people don't have a support system, how does that affect their long-term choices? And I think with these two books, you see how without good supports, how choices, how it, like in many ways, Kwan can't really make the choices that Justice makes.
Yeah. I think, I pulled an article from W.E.B. Du Bois, which it was written, I think, in 1867 or something, and he talked about double consciousness and how, African Americans often are dealing with, their African roots and their American roots, and they're unable to, even in this day, I mean, it was written so long ago, but it could have been read today, and the same thing keeps happening over and over again. And it's just how do we not keep repeating this over and over again?
I feel like, I mean, for me, I feel like we as people like dichotomies, even if they're not true. We feel much more comfortable if we can put people into categories. When you're the person that's being put in a category, that's not comfortable. But I think everyone does it. Everyone wants to feel comfortable about other people. And so they'll boil them down to A or B. And if they fit in both categories, they don't know how to deal with that. And I guess what, like, the hope that for me, that we won't, hopefully, continue these boxes of African and American, is that I feel like more people than not are seeing the gray in between, that there's these spaces of overlap for everyone, and that when we put people in A or B, we're dehumanizing them in a little way. Anytime we force them to follow those constraints, especially when they belong in the, where the Venn diagram meets. So I guess for me, the hope is that more people are willing to see that people don't fit in those categories, and that you actually have to kind of get to know people and be in their lives to really fully understand them, instead of just placing them in one state or another.
Mm-hmm. I think even further than that, with, Nic Stone had said once she got done with Dear Martin, she wasn't planning on writing another book. And then she got, I think, a couple of texts from some boys at a juvenile detention center saying, it's great and all that you wrote, Dear Martin, but most of us aren't, in these great schools destined for great things and, highly academic. Like, are you going to write a book for us? And so that was kind of the book that she wrote for them. And I just wonder, how it's going to be received. And I wonder, how do we as librarians kind of make sure that these books are just like, everybody gets to see these stories, like the story of Quan, just like they do the story of Justice or the story of the other ones. And I know, the Read Walk initiative is definitely helping to shine a light on a lot of these voices, but it's really important to have those individual stories. And just, I don't know, that's kind of how I saw with Dear Justice. It was just really kind of like, oh yeah, that's another powerful story. And it's kind of, it's the school to prison pipeline, and it's mass incarceration, and it's, huge systems that we need to take on. And they're not things that we just solve, but they're ways for us to put something under a lens and say, this isn't right, and this is happening, not just in this neighborhood, but it's also happening in that neighborhood. And I think it helps people band together and realize that we can really do work to make sure that someone like Quan can have the same kind of opportunity and access as someone like Justice, or any other kid that goes to school.
You ladies are just touching on all of the reasons that we do Read Woke. I love it so much. This is why we ask people to read and open up those doors for themselves and use fiction and harness the things that other people write in order to educate themselves, because the first step in affecting change is being educated and educating yourself about those issues that are important in our world right now. And that's, yeah, it's just lovely.
Being white, I like reading because it's also a safe place to encounter these voices that I might not otherwise have access, or it would feel strange or weird to have access to that kind of voice. It's a voice that needs to be heard. But I'm, I don't work with kiddos, and heaven forbid one of the kiddos that I do know get into the situation that Quan is. That would be awful. So I don't want that, but it's still a voice that needs to be heard, but that I think the majority of people don't hear it. And books are a really safe way for us to get to exposed to these ideas. And that's why I will recommend it hands down to whomever comes in my door at the library. So.
Awesome. Well, I don't know if you ladies have any other comments or questions, or if you have anything else coming up. I think we covered a lot of our discussion questions.
We were talking about the school to prison pipeline just very briefly. One more book recommendation, if you haven't read it, is Monique Morris's Push Out.
Oh, yeah.
It's nonfiction, but it is absolutely fantastic. And educate yourself.
That's a good one. That's a good one. It's highly really statistical too. It's just a lot of data, and you just can't fight with data.
Yeah. I'm really excited about reading Jacqueline Woodson's new book too, Cass. Yeah. Her first narrative nonfiction was just lovely, The Warmth of Other Suns, about the Great Migration. Mm-hmm. And this one looks just as good too. I've seen it on our hold shelf. Lots of people are requesting it.
Yeah, so. Yeah. I know. Good. It's by the time like the holds die down, you're like, oh yeah, I remember. I need that one.
Yeah, I picked it up off the shelf and like put someone's hold slip in the back very briefly, just so I could flip through it for a moment and get a little bit of a taste, because I'm like desperate for that book.
I think we all do that too. Whenever we see it like fresh on the shelf, we're like, how long can I read before I have to go back for my break or something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well,
I put a lot of a lot of that stuff on like hold through Libby and Overdrive, because what I love about that, especially with Libby now, is that if you put something on hold and then let's say you're in the middle of another book, you can just kind of pause that hold. So what I love about that is that when a book like this Jacqueline Woodson book, if it comes up, when it is free at this point, which could be like 20 weeks or something sometimes, by the time I get it, I can say, oh yeah, I'm going to put this to the top of my reading list, or I can just wait and someone else can get it. So yeah, I love, I do a lot of my reading that way, just kind of finagling that so that I can keep up with everything, because there's a lot of great books out there, a lot of great books right now being published on these topics that we covered today, and that are also in like high demand. So I say put them all on hold and then see what comes up in what reading order you get them.
Right.
So.
I'd like to correct myself. I said Cast and The Warmth of Other Suns are by Jacqueline Woodson, because she's on the brain right now, but those are by Isabel Wilkerson. Wilkerson is her last name.
I was gonna just say, like, what Jen was saying, I think another reason we know that, we're kind of in this new, we're forging a new way, I think, is just because people are so interested in these titles, and they are putting holds on these titles, and they want them, and they want to know these voices. And so if anything, that totally gives me hope. Seeing it from even board books, people coming in and picking up their little board books all the way through. It's just, it's really kind of, it's a good thing for sure.
I feel like at this point, anything and everything that I put on a Read Woke staff picks list on our webpage has been requested for a hold. And it's a good feeling.
Mm-hmm. That's great. All right, well, thank you so much, ladies, for joining me tonight. I think we covered some good stuff. I appreciate it. We have one more of these, How to Be an Anti-Racist, in November.